Oh, hello everybody. Okay, so welcome back. Today we're gonna talk about the screen of consciousness. A little bit of kind of like intuitions for why it's a difficult problem, and also a little bit of an intuition for how I'm kind of like approaching it. Um, I recently spent like 3 hours just obsessively thinking about this. I mean, it's in the back of my mind, and in fact, somebody like Richard Feynman said like one of the tricks to actually get a lot of good theoretical work done is to have something like 10 of your biggest problems always in the back of your mind, right? So that when you encounter uh, new techniques, new approaches, new arguments, or data, you always kind of like check it against those, right? So in my case, okay, like I'm in the back of my mind, we have like, okay, how does a screen of consciousness arise? How is like valence implemented? How do you quantify consonance and dissonance in arbitrary physical systems? Um, and of course, yeah, things having to do with like multi-agent coordination dynamics, generalized ethics. How do we define causality in a good, rigorous way? So yeah, when I encounter new data, new arguments, I actually tend to kind of like go through the list of problems that I obsess with, or are kind of like my life's mission to figure out. And yeah, sometimes like surprising things emerge. So anyway, yeah, even though the screen of consciousness is something that is in the back of my mind, recently it has been more in the forefront. Partly because I think I do have like some possible ways to tackle it. And we'll get into it in a moment. Before we get there, the quality of the day is um, benzo withdrawal. So, this is awful to discuss, but very important because actually, one of the early YouTube videos on my channel was, hey, like no nonsense approaches to benzodiazepine withdrawal. I want to say a couple things about this. This has actually gained more relevance in my life recently. I have personally never experienced benzodiazepine or withdrawal or the effect of the drugs, except for once they give me benzodiazepines in this hospital for some procedure where it was indicated. So I do have a little bit of a sense of the phenomenology of its acute effects. I have no idea what it feels like to come off of benzodiazepines after like years of using them. However, I do have friends who are in that position, and yeah, some people fairly close to me who actually have like the full blown kind of situation, like severe benzodiazepine withdrawal. So there's of course like some level of like personal motivation to figure out in what way we can help that cause. um, but more recently, in fact, at the Qualia Research Institute, one of the key projects and one of the key things that we focus on is pragmatic solutions for intense suffering. Um, Recently, the wonderful Alfredo Parra, collaborator, he has been collaborating with us and writing amazing like research papers on these topics. Um, and with Chris Percy, also another collaborator, amazing collaborator, he kind of like formalized and put into academic format the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain, which in academia is now called the heavy tails of valence hypothesis, um, which highlights that the very likely, if you're kind of like consequentialist utilitarian in any capacity and you actually care about quantifying suffering, it turns out that the extremes of suffering probably account for a very large percentage of the suffering worldwide. And because these long tails everywhere, I have talked about this in lots of places, I'll just mention quickly, chances are that specific distinct medical conditions probably account for the bulk of suffering in the world. um, and of the things that we have researched, places where you have like these like neglected, tractable and significant, like triad that effective altruists really care about, we have highlighted things like cluster headache relief, because like cluster headaches is really out there when it comes to suffering. It probably accounts for a very large percentage of human suffering, and getting rid of it is like relatively trivial for a high percentage of the population who suffers from it, such as using small doses of DMT, which I never get tired of repeating because it's so ethically important. And we're being really strategic about how to approach these, where essentially, yeah, we're crafting like policy and essentially, yeah, like open letters, like targeted to specific countries in order to hopefully pass legislation that will accelerate the, if not legalization, at least decriminalization for medical applications. Anyway, big rabbit hole and can of worms to unpack. The point is, recently we've done some preliminary analyses of like how severe the problem with benzodiazepines are, and it actually seems like up there. And there's like a good number of reasons. Like one of them is that unlike the withdrawal from other substances, benzodiazepine withdrawal takes a long time. For a lot of people, it takes like 8 months or like 2 years to kind of like get back to normal, and like it doesn't seem to you never really get back to normal if you use them every day for years. And just like the severity of the suffering is really extreme, and you can find this online if you Google for like, yeah, benzo withdrawal hell. You'll find lots of stories. This is not a mild thing. I mean, like in the extreme presentation, where maybe like 1 to 5% of the people who take benzodiazepines will be in this category. We're talking about something along the lines of feeling like you're being electrocuted, constantly for days and weeks, with no relief, without being able to sleep, with extreme restlessness, extreme kind of lightning effects in the body, and et cetera, et cetera. So figuring out how to reduce the suffering, actually, we think it's one of the big kind of like bang for your buck approaches for humanitarian interventions worldwide, which there's not going to be much of an opposition to it if we present like really good except for by the medical industry, who likes to pretend that these are like not as common as they are. And a lot of doctors are like wildly disinformed about this topic, and it's really frustrating, disappointing. But the point is that, yeah, this is not kind of like a politicized issue in the same way as other things where like, hey, you would have to battle 50% of people who have a different aesthetic. Yeah, if you find solutions to extreme suffering, you just go for them, because once people experience the relief, it's almost universal, except like actual sociopaths, or like actual sadistic people. Like 1% of the population is like no, let them suffer. But like, no, most people are like, no, I mean, at worst they don't care, right? Like, but typically people are like mildly happy at the very least to see the relief of suffering from others. Anyway, yeah, like one of the key kind of like features of benzodiazepine withdrawal is actually severe akathisia, restlessness, which sounds like it's not as bad as like pain, but actually extreme restlessness is really intense suffering. And of all of my research, I mean, I've also been talking to a lot of people with benzodiazepine withdrawal and kind of like seeing what helps. Interestingly, in terms of like cheap, available, probably quite safe supplements out there, these are like the 3 things I would actually recommend. They're like, yeah, I mean, they're kind of like a matchstick relative to a forest fire when it comes to like actually dealing with some of the serious side effects. But we're talking about kind of like a slow taper, where the effects are hopefully manageable, the withdrawal is hopefully manageable. Like PEA, black seed oil, and agmatine apparently all are quite helpful. And importantly, they're in a pharmacological category that at QRI we call anti-tolerance drugs, which are substances that are interesting because they seem to like modulate the tolerance mechanism. Which is to say, is not just kind of like, giving you something else that calms you down, but rather is kind of like actually getting at the, biochemical reasons why tolerance develops so strongly. These also work for other things. I'm told, for like opiates, for even weed withdrawal, and relevant to my life. Recently, actually they diminish the symptoms of a cold. So I wouldn't have been able to make this video a week ago because my voice was essentially gone for a few days. And actually this taking this as a stack, I could feel like very significant relief, definitely higher than like DXM, dextromethorphan, or antihistamines, which are like the things that are typically used for this. Anyway, we're already 10 minutes into the video. We haven't talked about the screen of consciousness, but so it goes. Okay, so um, serious ethical considerations aside, let's talk about the screen of consciousness. So the first thing I want to mention is that this is a very tough problem, and part of the reason it's tough, but definitely not the main reason, is that people don't even realize that it's a problem. Here's the thing, like, for a lot of people, like the unity of consciousness, they think of it in terms of like, functional unity, functional organization, something like, hey, like I may say, hey, it's kind of like a mystery or it's a puzzle how the brain is able to put together, like tactile information and visual information in order to create a unified moment of experience that contains both. And they might say, well, that's actually not a mystery because, you can train a multimodal model with, artificial neural networks that has like, like a kind of like a tactile field and a visual field. And then you have like a neural network that is integrating both streams of information. And then there's like an output that is taking into account both feeds. That is what I would call functional integration. And, right now, I would argue that, yeah, like artificial, intelligence systems have like really extraordinary functional integration, and that neuroscience has found a lot of hints for like how the brain would be able to functionally integrate information. But that is really not what the question is about. Neither like the phenomenal binding problem, which really is a precondition to even understand what I'm talking about when it comes to the screen of consciousness problem. We're talking about something much more actually like radical and ontological. I mean, like I'm asking you, not everybody's able to do this, right? But I'm asking you to sort of like realize that on a moment of experience, you have a unified, visual field and a unified tactile field and a unified like multimodal experience that, incorporates all of this information at once. And this is more than just behaving as if the information was integrated. I mean, like only, a hardcore behaviorist would believe that, actually behaving as information is integrated somehow like makes the information actually integrate into a unitary moment of experience. Really, the thing that we are like pursuing here is like what kind of ontology for reality would even be able to accommodate a notion of like something that is like unified, contains many pieces of information at once. It has like one subject all across that one experience, and it actually has causal effects where like the sum is more than so the total is more than the sum of the parts, and I mean that in the most non-trivial way possible, where like you actually have a system where like if you were able to change any part of it, the behavior of the whole changes in some sense instantly, as opposed to delayed through waiting for the information to propagate. And I do mean the word instant here is hard to qualify, because really the ground of meaning that we are trying to point at is phenomenal simultaneity, which is itself a rabbit hole. Why? Because there is a sense of the passage of time within a moment of experience. But I would say, like the moment of experience, the information that is quote unquote simultaneously presenting itself contains also these like axes of subjective temporal change. In other words, what phenomenologists call the spacious present, like the moment of experience is almost kind of like a four-dimensional hologram with one of the dimensions being time. And it's kind of like with soft tracers on both directions. So you have a little bit of a sense of like what's going to happen in the future. You have anticipation, but you also have like a sense of what happened in the past, but you don't identify with it, right? Like you actually keep it as a kind of representation. And likewise for the future, you understand it's like an anticipation. Now, on heavy doses of psychedelics, that thing which we call the pseudo time arrow, because it's not the physical time arrow, is the arrow of time within a moment of experience, which is representational and phenomenological, that can actually loop around, and you may end up having this very strange phenomenology we call time loops, where it feels like, the future and the past actually wrap around, and you're like trapped in a eternally repeating kind of like mini cycle or like pocket universe. Um, an even more extreme manifestation of, changes to the zero time arrow involve the collapse of, future and past into the present moment, something that we call moments of eternity, which usually happen on pretty high doses of psychedelics, although is more likely to happen on 5-MeO DMT and also during meditation. Anyway, when I say like the information is presented simultaneously, this is tricky because people will say, well, not really, right? Like I'm darting around my attention, and like I'm only really paying attention to one bit of information at a time, right? But there's two problems here, right? It's like actually that feeling of kind of like moving around and refocusing your attention is happening within phenomenal time, right? Like when you moved your attention from one place to another, um, when you arrived at that new place, you actually still have a tracer effect of where you were before. And without that tracer, the new focus of your attention would be decontextualized. And in fact, the very meaning of your experience, actually unfolds through kind of this like superposition of the tracer of your previous, immediate phenomenal past together with your present. And there's an integration, a phenomenal integration that happens between those two elements that give rise to the current meaning. But there's like other issues too. I mean, like really there is anything that you pay attention to is contextualized not only by the immediate past, but also the surrounding present. This is why, at the Qualia Research Institute and actually also mainstream neuroscience and cognitive science, we distinguish between attention and awareness, right? So like attention, it is this like fairly sequential kind of like concentration of like Qualia resources to actually disambiguate stimuli and find connections and bind together different pieces of information. And awareness is the context within which that happens. And if attention existed without the awareness that is giving its context, it would be meaningless, right? It's like, imagine if your experience is like, hey, this is a 1, here's a 0, here's a 1, here's a 0, versus like, hey, here's a 1 within a sea of zeros that is contextualizing it, right? Like it's very different. So, and more so, exotic states of consciousness and meditation indicate that these kind of like sequential, kind of like laser-like or a flashlight type of conception of attention is a special case of something more general, right? Like if you take LSD at a certain dosage, there's kind of this like fragmentation of attention where you may have like actually two kind of like flashlights of attention that are simultaneously kind of like coexistent. And something like DMT in particular, can really fragment your experience into lots of different competing clusters of coherence, each of those with its own flashlight of attention. And they're, this is neither parallel nor sequential. It's actually something stranger. It's something stranger. It's like a superposition of parallel and sequentiality. And so, the question is not how you can like create a system that functionally behaves as it being able to integrate these pieces of information, because that's a solved problem, but it's a different type of problem. Really, the question is, how does the experience of it come into place, right? Like, how does it arise? Now, yeah, if somebody, let's say, like believes something like, well, maybe it's an illusion, maybe it does, like, in the kind of like eliminativist camp, I would say that they're kind of like at level -1, where like they have actually like denied the very problem that they're trying to solve, or think that denying it is the actual answer, which is a huge waste of time for the most part, like talking with eliminativists, from my experience. Sorry, sorry guys. And usually there's like introspective deficits, or something kind of like really extreme need for closure or social validation, or they're afraid of being perceived as, gullible by believing in these like mysterious properties of consciousness or something like that. But it's like, no, dude, like be honest with yourself, like recognize that, oh gosh, like consciousness has qualia, has like simultaneous attention and awareness. It has these like very strange property, which is like the simultaneous presentation of, seriality and parallelism. And sure, if it's an illusion, you still have to explain how that illusion works. But I don't think it's an illusion. I mean, I think it's like actually a hint about how reality works fundamentally, and what kind of thing it is. So getting on to kind of like the very object level that I want to discuss is, um, how do you get like a point of view out of a universe that, let's say, it's made of atoms and forces, or like a universe that is kind of like a cellular automaton where you are essentially like updating, ones and zeros based on their immediate neighbors, something like in Conway's Game of Life. I will mention there that even in Conway's Game of Life, you do have like some non-trivial kind of mysterious mechanism for binding, because each square is in some sense, aware of all of the squares around it. Like that simultaneity, like what's up with that? What is implementing that? Like that itself is not a just one and zero interacting. Um, and uh, and then, more so, you do have kind of like this problem that you don't have anywhere where there's like many pieces of information all at once with a clean boundary in such a way that the contents inside that boundary behave as a unit in a non-trivial way. Where like with a cellular automaton, you can always decompose what is happening into just like the various like squares. Whether it's a glide, like a little creature that is kind of like moving around in in a cellular automaton, or a really complex, computer that you implement. Um, any kind of like segmentation that you choose within that cellular automaton is kind of like your own choice. It's arbitrary. It's actually observer dependent. You could imagine people with different, cognitive styles looking at a cellular automaton and drawing very different conclusions about what is going on and what kind of beings are being implemented there. If you have very much a kind of like laser-like type of attentional system, you might say like, well, yes, gliders are real, but anything larger isn't. Or if you're kind of like a very, holistic, big picture type of thinker, you might say, well, no, only these very complex kind of like recursive processes that you see when you zoom way out in Conway's Game of Life have any sort of kind of a, gestalt properties, whereas maybe at the level of a glider, like it's not even real or quite real yet. But hey, it's observer dependent, and in fact, any of those partitions, any way you choose to segment out kind of like the squares within a cellular automaton is epiphenomenal. It doesn't add anything to the computation. It doesn't change the computation. The computation continues to be just these tiny circles, tiny local environments. So the first thing I want to say actually is like, my conception of computation is more general. It's not a Turing machine. It's not just a standard cellular automaton. I'm talking about a conception of computation that is more general, where the inputs, the intermediate steps, and the outputs are all allowed to be, unified physical systems that have holistic properties, that behave as units, that are unitary in some sense, that contain these many pieces of information all at once, and that maybe, you can probe them in various ways. For me, the general conception of computation would be a computer where the inputs can be like soap bubbles or, quantum coherent objects or, like dynamic systems. And the intermediate steps involve things such as like, hey, I'm going to shine a laser on this object from this perspective, or I'm going to collapse it from this perspective. I'm going to have these two objects like resonate with each other and then measure the Fourier decomposition of the vibration of the system as a whole. All of those things are kind of like holistic computing. Of course, if the universe, you think of it as a cellular automaton, like Conway's Game of Life, all of that still is, hey, you can simulate it with a computer, so to speak, of the first boring kind of like Turing machine type. However, in physics, that is just not the case. I mean, like in physics, in real physics, you have actually all of these situations where, in order to understand like with the next step or the next configuration in a system, you do need to take into account the entire system all at once. And you can't really just kind of like segment it into like its subcomponents and then like compute those independently, because they all affect each other. There's an all-to-all relationship in those systems, in particular in quantum mechanics, where you have path integrals, where you're like taking into account all of the possible paths and interactions that a system could have. And then you have like the superposition of all of those. and then there's a probability function that comes out of that superposition. Yes, that type of system is much more, of the computational type that I am proposing, where inputs, intermediate steps, and outputs can be these unitary, ontologically unified, holistic objects that interact with each other and produce like non-trivial computation along the way. So that is one thing, like generalized computing. But then I want to talk about like how you could, even when you have like generalized computing, you still have like the question of like, how do you get the specific phenomenology, that humans have? How is it that you can have like this perspective on kind of a visual field where it feels like there's some kind of like homunculi or like kind of like a camera, and you are kind of like a camera looking at a screen. Now, here's the thing, it's very common in spiritual circles, in psychedelic circles. People will rightly point out the screen of consciousness is an illusion. They might say, hey, I took 600 micrograms of acid and it dissolved, and so I know it's an illusion, right? So why care about it? And the same, like along the path of awakening, especially when it comes to the dimension of increased sensory clarity, and also 5-MeO-DMT in particular really goes there quite a bit. It's very common to actually go through a stage. Some people, Frank Yang calls it the screen of God, where the screen of consciousness becomes like even more crisp. And like it really feels like you're looking at a kind of like 4K, super high definition screen from a specific point of view. And it looks really hyper real in a sense. It's like, oh gosh, like I cleaned kind of like the doors of perception, so to speak. People might be poetic in those states. But then, they go further, and they might say, well, yeah, but then I became like centerless, and then like actually I broke down like the sense of the observer. And now just every sensation is exactly what arises. They might use like poetic language like that. They might say something like, hey, I used to believe that sensations were being perceived by a central observer, but like now they just exist in whatever way they exist without a perceiver, without a witness, so to speak. Well, yes, however, of course, I actually think the screen of consciousness is illusory in that sense, but I mean illusory actually, not in the sense of like not real and therefore not important to explain, but I mean it in the sense of it's a special case of possible, unified moments of experience. But therefore, it's something that any theory of consciousness also has to account for. You see, it's the same as with physics, right? Like you could say something like, hey, like the liquid water is an illusion. Why? Because I have heated it up and it turned into gas. Yes, that's an important insight, especially if you're talking to people who have only ever seen liquid water, right? Like, and then you say like, no, it can also be ice. It can turn into something solid. Yes, but if you want a theory of physics that actually explains the whole thing, you have to also explain how the water happens, right? Like you that is part of the thing that you have to explain. In fact, now you have to explain more. Now, the advantage though, is that you're not stuck with an ontology where water is kind of this like irreducible, impossible to break down, like primary element of reality. Like, no, you start to realize, hey, water is an emergent property of something more fundamental. And the screen of consciousness is like that the sense of there being kind of this screen and you being, a camera behind it is something that, the field of consciousness, quantum fields, the topology of electromagnetic fields, whatever the ontology we want to use, can give rise to, okay? And we have to explain that. So first of all, this is very difficult. Why? Because, I mean, like let's think through, like kind of like how you can do this, right? Like to have a screen, like the experience of a screen, which is not even just kind of like a two-dimensional flat space, is actually something more interesting, right? It's kind of like the rendering of the process of kind of like a 3D volume collapsing into a point, right? Like really kind of the screen of consciousness is something like, okay, you have like the dome of experience, so to speak. and you have it slowly kind of like collapsing towards the observer. And so the observer, so to speak, is able to notice kind of the differences, the distances that exist between itself and the various perceptions, right? And one thing that I think it's is a very important kind of like insight here is that the consistency of the experience, in some sense, um, can be pointed at by saying that there is a projective um, dynamic that gives rise to kind of like a consistent metric, right? Like where you actually can locate places in this kind of like three-dimensional or 2.5-dimensional space, and you can know intuitively how far away they're from each other, and understand kind of like that behavior. Um, but how does this actually like present itself, not as kind of this abstract metric where like different objects have like different distances to each other, but an actual embodied geometric space? In philosophy of mind, they actually call these the um, um, okay. In philosophy of mind, they call this the spatiality of phenomenology problem. And integrated information theory has like some ideas for how to tackle these. Um, but yeah, no, it's a real problem. I will say that actually, the real phenomenology, in a sense, is more. You really have to take into account the fact that we have like two eyes for like the full kind of like richness of the depth map. It's more something like this. It's kind of like two kind of like overlapping kind of observer points, in a sense, that kind of like know their distances from each other, in a sense, and can triangulate how far different elements within the experience are by kind of like the difference in the projection onto these two different points. um and But it's full of artifacts, right? Like if you put your finger pretty close, right, like it actually kind of like becomes like double. Or if you focus on it, what's behind becomes double. I would say this kind of like doubling is actually, in some sense, um, the building block of the sense of depth. That the degree towards things like double or become like fuzzy, also that has to do with kind of like the focusing distance with your eyes, are like clues that are used to kind of like create these like metric, these like shared environment where like everything knows how far it is from each other. Now, what I will say is that, something like a DMT, or especially DMT, but psychedelics in general, they tend to fragment these. And there's like a sense in which, the experience of like high dose LSD can be understood as kind of like a field of sensations that now are being perceived by many eyes as opposed to just one eye. Intuitively, one way of kind of elaborating on this is that, on psychedelics, you move your hand around and you see tracer effects. Um, well, on high doses of psychedelics, it stops being just that sensations kind of like last longer, and becomes more that like the entire world simulation becomes kind of like overlapping with itself. And so you have kind of the entire world simulation with its actual, like depth structure overlapping with itself. And you have kind of like different perspectives on the same kind of like metric space, all overlapping with each other. And because there's also like noise, there's like some drifting effects that can turn into kind of this like complex web of like new kinds of distances that effectively may emulate the behavior of higher dimensional spaces in some ways, which is a whole other topic, and it's very very important, and also very very related to the screen of consciousness, but it's a lot more non even more non-trivial. But okay, so here's like a key argument for like why this is so hard, like in a normal kind of Euclidean universe with um like atoms and forces. um you know in physics, in general relativity, special relativity, everything is kind of like the core proposition is that the laws of physics look the same from every inertial frame of reference. Now, an inertial frame of reference usually is defined as kind of like a grid where you assume that, like every, line, every segment like measures the same. It might be like a 1 by 1 by 1 grid by one, where like the last one is time. So kind of like clocks in each of the vertices, as it were. Um, and then, to measure distances or the plane of simultaneity, what you do is you look at kind of like how long it takes, for signals to arrive from a particular source to each of the lattice points within this frame of reference. Now, here's the thing. If your cube is a 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 cube, and you're using it to triangulate, distances, that's all well and good. However, you need something that is able to integrate the information about, when these signals arrive. And who is doing that? Another cube? The problem is that you eventually get to this like infinite recursion problem. I mean, exactly the same as like people who complain about the Descartes kind of the Cartesian theory model of consciousness, which is like, okay, like, yeah, you have a homunculi inside that is perceiving the screen, so to speak. Who is perceiving, what this like homunculi is perceiving? Is it like another little guy inside the little guy? The same with like frames of reference. Now, conceptually, the way this ends up kind of working mathematically, formally, is that, you kind of like swallow the frame of reference into each point in a sense. You kind of like equip a point with a metric, and you actually like measure kind of like its curvature with parallel transport. You actually kind of look at, if you move around a vector and you come back to the same point, how much does it change direction? And you're essentially kind of like equipping every point with a lot of pieces of information. Like we're not talking about anymore about just a mathematical point, because a mathematical point has like zero information, right? So, but then the question is like, okay, where does that data structure exist? Or like, where is that data structure? So reality wouldn't actually just be, in a sense, a collection of points that are related in a certain way, because every point needs to also have kind of like the information about its immediate environment and have its kind of metric tensor like embedded within it, which is, again, something that has multiple pieces of information at once. Again and again, we have like this issue of where like, where do you find these multiple pieces of information at once in like standard models of reality? And as far as I can tell, for the most part, in most, conventional models, that is like swept under the rug, because you end up actually kind of like swallow, or kind of like embodying those costs, or billing for those costs at the point of view of interpretation, right? It's like, it's the theoretician, is the person thinking about theory who's integrating that information. But the model itself doesn't have that information integrated, if that makes sense. To get it more stark, I mean, like, imagine you do have kind of this 1 by 1 by 1 frame of reference, right? And you're kind of like seeing, you want to know, let's say there's a star here and it explodes, and so when, let's say, the plasma reaches different corners of this cube, will be, in a sense, what you can use to triangulate where that is and when it is relative to this frame of reference. Okay, but we have the problem of, okay, but like, who is witnessing this frame of reference? Who is like integrating these pieces of information in order to actually arrive at this conclusion that, hey, the star is over here and in that direction? Well, assume that it's kind of like a camera, like this is the thing. It's, you have kind of like an aperture here, and then you have a screen behind, and the information from each, of the corners goes through that aperture and gets projected into the screen of that camera, kind of like all of the sensors behind the camera. Okay, so I think intuitively, a lot of people actually think of the screen of consciousness as just this. It's like, hey, yeah, we have like some mechanism inside us that is providing like a kind of like an aperture, and then we are measuring kind of like a screen behind it, where, the rays are arriving and when. And that is kind of like how we figure out a frame of reference through which, relate everything to everything. There is a fundamental problem here, which is how does the information in the camera get integrated, and who is integrating that information, and how do you get, again, this like property of many pieces of information all at once that behave as a unit and has these like unitary, phenomenal properties. um, and the argument for me, it's actually fairly simple why like this metaphor is actually misguided, or at least like it's definitely very far from complete. And it's as follows. There's really kind of like two options here. One is to say the information is getting aggregated in the aperture of the camera, meaning like the tiny hole through which like the light, must go through. Um, and the problem here, though, is that if this was a point, again, as we said, points have no information; they're zero dimensional. That cannot integrate many pieces of information at once. So it has to actually be like an entire kind of like circle, like the actual like area in a sense. But and there's actually a deep physical reason also why this has to be something more than a point, which is that there's such a thing as called like the diffraction limit, where if something is too small, there's actually like some wavelengths that can't go through without getting like distorted. And so like if you want to measure, wavelengths of a certain size, you require like an aperture of a certain size. So essentially this is like something extended in space and also extended in time. And then to have the question of like, okay, but like who is to say that that is a meaningful kind of like, meaningful object, that actually hangs together as a unified moment of experience that contains all of that information? Why not half of the aperture, right? Like, or why not like half of the aperture and like a chunk of something outside? Again, this is kind of like with the cellular automaton scenario, where how you choose to partition the physical system is like something that really is kind of like, it depends on each observer and each observer's kind of like choices and predilections. So yeah, you're not going to go very far with the aperture being like the mechanism of binding, the mechanism that is allowing you to have kind of this screen of consciousness. So what about the screen? Well, the screen has another problem, which is, okay, sure, like things arrive at different sensors in the screen, but how do they become combined afterwards? And if you say something like, well, somebody else is observing the screen, right? You have like the same problem that then you have, again, the aperture or the screen of that observer, and it becomes an infinite recursion problem again. In other words, to kind of like have like a camera be the thing that allows you to have a screen of consciousness, itself requires another camera to interpret the content of the camera. And then you require another camera to interpret the content of the camera. And it's ultimately just a non-starter. So, and yeah, I mean, I have no idea if this is landing for most of you guys. And I don't think I'm doing that good of a job at explaining, but it is, I do think this is absolutely a real, very real problem. And it is along the lines of kind of the thought experiments that Einstein might have done, like, hey, like what happens when you move at the speed of light and you look at a mirror sort of thing, where like, because he's a stickler, he's saying like, hey, like the laws of physics must be able to explain those cases as well. And likewise here is like, hey, like, yeah, like if we take seriously the unity of experience and the geometry of experience, we have to be able to answer all of these questions. It's not really optional, even if you don't think much about it. Like these are real problems that need to be addressed. Now, let me give you a little bit of kind of like a sketch of how I do think about this. So, I think there is a mechanism in the universe that allows for like actual topological segmentation of regions of kind of like a field of consciousness, such that when you segment it out, you actually have holistic properties. And I've used this metaphor a lot in the past, but let me just like remind you, which is that imagine that, yeah, like the field of consciousness is a balloon, so to speak, right? And then if you twist a balloon from two ends, eventually you actually get kind of like two balloons that share a pinch point, right? And what happens here, this is actually called a topological segmentation, right? Because you actually collapsed a whole kind of like perimeter into just one point, right? Like that's a dimensional collapse. And it's a difference in degree that cashes out into a difference in kind, right? Like it used to be a sphere, and now it's like two spheres connected by a point. It's a topologically different object. And so if you want to go from one point here to a point here, you will be forced to go through that bottleneck, the zero-dimensional bottleneck, right? So like there's a very non-trivial sense in which the information that is in this side of the sphere, gets lost when it goes through this point and goes to the other side of the sphere. So in effect, even though there may be one object ontologically in some sense, informationally and causally, there is some like absolute segmentation here. Now, really, kind of like a more kind of like comprehensive view of kind of the field of consciousness here would equip actually the field with the vectors and curvature and a lot of like other properties. And topological segmentation may be more kind of like the topology of a vector field, where you have like things such as, like cycles, where like a line, for example, if you follow the arrows of the vector field, there's a precise place where you're kind of like trapped in a circle. If you go outside of it, you start to spiral out, and if you go inside of it, you start to spiral in. And that is like one of those cases where effectively you have, hey, this whole region goes towards infinity, this whole region goes towards infinity, but this one region kind of like stays the same, and you form this kind of like closed circuit. I'm gonna suggest that yeah, like a moment of experience is something like that. It's kind of one of these like closed circuits of reality, and other parts of the universe, they kind of like diverge without like a closure, without satisfaction, so to speak. Well, I am gonna suggest actually that the whole apparatus of the brain is something like this like nonlinear optical computer that is taking into account like these holistic objects and is operating them with each other. And it operates them in a number of ways. One of the ways in which it does it is with beam splitters. So you have kind of this like hologram, it's this almost three-dimensional, holistic superposition of waves. And what it's like to be that is kind of the superposition of all possible paths within it. Again, that has like the right kind of shape for the ontology, which is superposition of kind of like oneness and many pieces of information, both simultaneously. That it's closed, but also there's like internal richness and detail, and it's not just kind of like statically there. It's actually kind of like a dynamic system where like all of the paths are like simultaneously present. I think like something of that shape is probably what will turn out to be closer to what consciousness is like, and the core kind of like building block or core idea here is, yeah, let me draw it really quick. Yeah, maybe like this. I mean, effectively, you will have to think of it as kind of like a very large grid. Let's start with just kind of like a two-dimensional grid, each of which has beam splitters. So like the mirrors that separate each of these compartments within the grid are kind of like semi-transparent. Some of the light bounces back and some of the light goes through. And then on top of that, you have like fiber optic wires that allow you to take images of these compartments and move them elsewhere, and then like further operate on them. Okay, so first of all, yeah, think about it this way. So like, let's say you have kind of these, different compartments, and each of those, has a barrier that is kind of this like beam splitter, like part of the light goes through, part of the light reflects. Now, think of it, yeah, kind of like a funhouse mirror or like Indra's net type of system. What happens when you shine light in here, right? Like what will happen is that inside every one of these compartments, there's going to actually be something kind of like a superposition of what it is like to be inside all of the other compartments, right? And in fact, the central one might kind of like actually have kind of more of this like centeredness quality, where like it is at the center of the hurricane where like there's an infinitely kind of like repeating fractal around it, but like this one is like the center of the fractal, right? Like it does have kind of this like special place, and is also from a page rank perspective, meaning kind of like if you do like a random walk in this system, the higher probability mass and or the largest like light amplitude will actually be in the center. So that is kind of like the most likely one. Now imagine, okay, like if what it's like to be the light in that system is the superposition, of all of the possible paths. Okay, so when you're in one of the compartments, if it was actually perfectly mirrored, um, what would happen is that all the paths would actually start to look the same. And the standing wave pattern, or like the kind of like the main mode within that compartment, is symmetrical, rotationally symmetrical if it's a sphere, or if it's a hexagon, could be like symmetrical in other ways, reflection and rotation in 6 ways. And so like all of those perspectives actually cancel out and like merge with each other. Yeah, let me give you like a quick example here. Like one of the kind of like classical thoughts that I have is like, okay, what is it like to be a cube from the point of view of these like path integral perspective? Well, it's kind of the superposition of like what it's like to be here plus what it's like to be here plus what it's like to be here, and so on. And in practice, this would be something like this. It would be like kind of this like strange thing where there's actually just kind of like one corner, right? Because like the cube looks the same from each of those corners, right? So like when there's many perspectives within the object where the object looks the same to itself, all of those kind of like collapse into the same perspective. The reason why I started to even think about this in this way is that, on high dose like psychedelics, like you have this like very strange property where you may be experiencing this really complex, intricate, fractal with lots of kind of like mirror reflections. And then you look at it from a certain internal perspective, and then the whole thing collapses into just one point. Meaning, consciousness is not like a painting where, or at least like our types of consciousness is not like a painting where, two images, their distance is kind of like measured by, how many pixels you need to flip to go from one image to the other, right? Because here we have a case where like a super complex fractal is right next to this point, right? Like, and this point experience. So is much more along the lines of kind of like the configuration space of like two mirrors that are like parallel to each other, right? Is like if you're slightly off, slightly off, you will see like lots of reflections, but it will have like a shape. It will be kind of these like trumpet-like, or these kind of like, yeah, kind of like tunnel-like that becomes kind of like parabolic and like diverges. But the moment you get it perfectly aligned, especially if there's distance 0, then the whole thing collapses, right? And actually just feels like an infinite space without any distortions. I'm going to suggest is something like that we have like all of these different compartments, and they're all reflecting each other. And what is like to be you is a superposition of all of those compartments simultaneously. And when there's like some kind of like closure or symmetry, they all look the same. And so actually it feels like there's nothing happening. So in this model, like cessation actually happens when like the internal content on inside each of the compartments is identical, which can happen in a bunch of different ways with these type of like optical systems. And on the other hand, like other kind of like states of consciousness that have a lot of information are effectively generated by the differences in what it looks like to be each of those different compartments. Now, the full kind of like thinking that I'm applying is not just, these layers. To begin with, you actually have like 2 of these, and then you have tubes that connect these 2 sides to each other, which effectively causes kind of this stereoscopy between them. And then on top of that, you have like multiple layers of those, each with kind of like grids of different sizes. So by the time you go to kind of like one of the very large ones, there's only a few kind of like compartments in there. And then there's like a largest one, which is just one big cavity. So what I'm going to suggest is that I think that, what it's like to be you in a sense is kind of like what it's like to be, okay, let's say like the optical components, the, microtubule resonances in each of the neurons. But the neurons are organized in this grid-like fashion. And plus there's two hemispheres and it's hierarchical. And I'm actually, hypothesizing here that when you superimpose the perspective, the shape, the standing wave pattern of all of those, it actually looks like a screen of consciousness. Now, I still have to demonstrate this, and I plan on doing like a bunch of simulations. But I think it's a very promising idea. And I think I can actually get the kind of like 2.5D nature of experience with those principles. I think that's it for now. I mean, like, I also want to say that like very few people, I think, like actually realize kind of like the very strange property of consciousness, that it's like, it's not just one and it's not many, but it's like the superposition of like one and many. And I think like that, reality actually ends up being made of building blocks that are like that, both internally and externally. And so, yeah, I mean, I see reality just so, differently than I used to. Like if we go back to, when I was a kid, at first I thought like, hey, there's like souls and there's like, matter and electrons. I almost kind of had like this dualist perspective, then eventually became a materialist and then became an idealist, in that I thought like, hey, it's all consciousness. And briefly even considered things like solipsism and other perspectives. But implicitly in all of those views, I always had kind of like a set theoretic kind of like understanding of like the makeup of the universe. And it wasn't until, I guess like learning about like path integrals in the context of Feynman's lectures of physics that I realized, hey, hold on a second, actually, reality is very strange because, to see like how an electron will move from one place to other, you actually need to kind of like compute all of the possible superposition of paths between, how it itself may interact with its other paths. And what kind of object is that? And who is doing that computation, right? Like it's very, very mysterious. But one property that stands out is that it is like this strange superposition of like oneness and multiplicity, right? Like that reality kind of like fragments into all of its possibilities, every option at once. And then it collapses back through some kind of like bottleneck where many of those paths add up to something meaningful, but most of those paths actually cancel each other out. And I think like that absolutely happens and has explanatory power when it comes to exotic states of consciousness. And that something like the geometric looking screen of consciousness that we're used to is really just a super special case of all of these. Well, with that, thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully this was interesting, enlightening. And hopefully my voice wasn't too bad. And yeah, I'm especially curious. Yeah, definitely. If you have a cold, at some point, give these 3 a try. Or if you're experiencing withdrawal from something, and let me know. I mean, it's might actually be, I don't think it's. I don't think these, they're more kind of like research leads. They're not like the solution by any means, but I just see like a future where like we'll be able to find maybe through peptides or, anti-tolerance, like small molecules, a way to actually, like reverse and prevent like biochemical dependence, chemical dependence. And I think that would be just a massive value add for humanity and sentience as a whole. So anyway, with that, thank you so much for tuning in. Infinite bliss, everybody. Take care. Ciao.